Greetings. My name is Yirser, Hotep, and I'm here with my brother Yusef Sudah. And what we're going to do is that we're going to engage in a conversation that I've been wanting to engage in with him for quite some time. And we're just going to call this like a conversation in consciousness, or something like that.
Okay.
And my brother here is I call him the architect. And I call him that based upon the architect that you see in the movie The Matrix, because, you know, the architect in The Matrix, he had this very deep, resonant voice, and he was able to articulate and break down the composition of the Matrix, right? And in addition to having that ability, in terms of brother Yusef being able to break down the architecture of the matrix that we live in, he's also a real architect, you know, that builds buildings and things. So what we want to explore for, you know, very briefly is the nature of consciousness. Where does consciousness come from? We hear people talking about they are woke. We hear people say that they're conscious. We hear this thing about consciousness. And, you know, it appears that everybody has a different idea of what consciousness is. You have so many divisions and so many different divisions and versions of what's conscious and what's reality. You know, not only in the African American community, but it seems like on a global level that it's all of these hard-line boundaries about what reality is and what's real. You have these religious differences, you have spiritual differences, you have philosophical differences, ideological differences, and so on and so forth. And so, to me, most of these differences are artificial, right?
Okay.
And they are coming from a place of conditioning, right? So, because people are basically conditioned by their environment, they're conditioned by their upbringing, by their background, in ways which they're not conscious of, even though they say that they're conscious,
Sure.
but they're being influenced and conditioned in ways that they're not conscious of. And so I'm just saying those things to sort of set the foundation for our conversation.
Sure.
So, so what are your thoughts? Just.
Well, thank you. I was not aware that you wanted to have this conversation with me for quite some time, but I appreciate that, and truly is an honor to have been thought of in that particular fashion. I make a distinction between, excuse me one second, I make a distinction between reality, excuse me, and actuality. Thank you. Mm-hmm. I think all of us have a reality, and that reality is based upon some of the conditions which you name: environment, what we're taught, how we're trained, where we live, who communicates with us, how well they can communicate, whether they can communicate, depending upon their ability to articulate a point of view. All of those things affect our reality. Example, we have an affinity for someone, and out of that affinity for someone, we can share their reality. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that their reality is an actuality. So I make a distinction between those two things. I think that oftentimes when we talk or we communicate, we say reality when in fact we may mean actuality, and vice versa, okay? When we talk about consciousness, there are different levels of realization that we have acquired based upon, again, experiences that we have, environments that we lived in, where we grew up, race that we might be, nationality we have, the environment that we have participated in the course of a day. Those things do shift, change, alter. So I think there's a distinct difference between consciousness and realization. We all have realizations, but not necessarily are all those realizations, one, the same. They are different, and they are different at different times. Usually when we talk about consciousness, we may have an idea about some familiarity with some idea, some thought, some concept, some belief, some concern. When we as African people talk about consciousness, we oftentimes are delving into a realm of ancient realization having to do maybe with Kemetic principles. and those principles might awaken a certain kind of reflective understanding within us. And as such, we identify with that consciousness in such a way that we want to buy into it because it somehow has relieved pressure, concern, given us an understanding about something that we did not have at some earlier time, caused us to have a realization that was different from that which we were sort of birthed on, depending upon our parents, things of that kind. If we are persons of African descent, our consciousness usually is geared toward that area that awakens in us some ancient perspective of ourselves as a people with a quality of certainty and a quality of positiveness, a quality of assurance, a quality of interest that we would like to regain that capability, that understanding that at some point in time that we have learned in present time, but somehow was sitting there waiting for us to have an understanding of it at a time long gone past. Frequently, as I have had the occasion to be honored to talk about the consciousness of African people or the revival of African understanding, it's useful for us to understand as a people we are the creators of mankind. That has a particular value because it meant that once we were here on the planet, there was nothing here, no thing here other than those living creatures that were around us. Doesn't mean that nothing was here, it just means that there were no human beings here. So we're the creators of humankind.
Right, so now you're sounding like the architect.
Ah, okay.
Yes.
So as a result of that, we had to create thought. And that's particularly important because there were no thoughts in advance of our arrival. So as long as there's been people on the planet, there have been African people. There's never a time, the converse of course, there's never a time when there were people that there weren't African people. So as such, we created thought. Out of the capability of creating thought and the ability of creating thought, we created thinking. We see a manifestation of thinking as a byproduct of what we see in the final stages, let's say, of Egypt. Egypt is only the hallmark of that culmination simply because the construction that was there remains there in plain sight.
Yes, I always say that Kemet or ancient Egypt was the blossoming of something.
Yes.
And that we only relate to Kemet because of the fact that we have the most evidence of it.
Yes.
As opposed to other civilizations that may have existed even prior to that. So what you're saying is that in the beginning that there had to be thought, but even before thought, there was mind. There had to be a mind, a consciousness from which thinking and thought could
emerge. Yes. There had to be some source by which thought could emerge. If not, there could not have existed the byproduct being thought. So there had to be mind. And there is a distinct difference between brain and mind. Frequently, we say we see things. Oftentimes, we are referring to the meat elements that sit within our head that are called eyes. But that's not what one really looks with. There's a difference between looking and seeing. One looks with the eyes, but one sees with the mind. The value of making that distinction is we can be deceived when we only look with the eyes. But if we look with the mind, we can see many things that are not visible, but they're present. So it's sort of like, I oftentimes use the analogy that we don't see the obvious. Air is present, but we don't see it.
Yeah, and air is the most important thing that we have around us because we would be non-existent if it wasn't for air in about 5 minutes.
Yeah.
But we don't see it, we can't taste it, we don't never think about it.
And more specifically as it relates to air, as it relates to keeping the physical form. The value of understanding that there's you and there's your body. There's a distinct difference. A reference to that has to do with if one has ever experienced the transition of a loved one and they're in a casket or a box in some kind of repose position, they know that the person that they know is not there. The body is there. And it's actually literally referred to as the body. And that's factual. And that's also, that fact results in a truth that one cannot ignore because the person that they know is no longer present, okay? So being aware that, in fact, there's a consciousness, there has to be some elemental something that's present that gives life and that gives a stability as an unseen to thought, which again is another unseen, but we can manifest thought by virtue of creating things within the physical universe.
So would you say that becoming aware of that unseen aspect of reality, the unseen force from which everything emerges, that unseen mind, the unseen breath, so to speak, that unseen thing which is really the foundation of consciousness?
Yes. Well, it also manifests itself in very simple ways. For example, we know that the planet itself has nothing underneath it. It's being held by something that's unseen. That's true of anything within the universe. It's filled with unseen qualities that gives it stability, gives it strength, gives it cyclicality, so to speak, that everything operates in a cycle, not in a straight line, not linear.
So how can a person be conscious without being aware of the unseen world and without acknowledging it?
I would suggest that it's not possible, okay?
Right.
Because the unseen has much more strength, much more value, and much more presence, and it is far more prevalent than the seen. Yet we tend to, again, look with our eyes as opposed to look with our mind. But when we think about thinking in such a way, we grasp the fact, if it is indicated in a very clear way, that the unseen is present. And usually, as a result of speaking with someone, it is possible to get them to see with the mind the unseen because they're aware that it's there, though they don't look at it.
So the first step in developing true consciousness is to become aware of the unseen world, to acknowledge it, and to acknowledge the unseen as being the source of the all.
Yes. Yeah, and that alludes, of course, to one of the Kemetic principles, and that being all is the mind and the mind is all. That has particular value because if you can grasp that as essential understanding, then there are things that you can address with another person that opens up their understanding because you're not fixating them on a thing, meaning some physical entity, but in fact having to do with the concept, an idea that is all-encompassing of that which they do intuitively understand, but they may not physically be able to grasp, you know. And that is the difference to understanding to some degree the difference between process and content. The process of the universe is present. The concept, the process of cyclic motion is present. You know, the sun doesn't set, though we think it does. That's what our eyes see. But in fact, the sun is never out. It always shines. It's always there.
It never changes.
It never changes. It's just that the cyclic process of the Earth moving in its own rotation and its own evolution or revolution is rotating around something that in fact is always present, and we call that sunset or sunrise. But that's an illusion because we're looking at it with our meat eyes as opposed to really understanding that the sun never sets. That makes a difference in your consciousness. If you consciously understand that the sun is always shining, it's always present, then you will understand the delusion and illusion that you accepted as sunset and sunrise is being just that.
Okay, so we're sort of winding down in our time, but
Yes.
it seems like another principle that you're coming to, in addition to the fact that that there's an unseen
Yes.
from which everything emerges from, even thought, that there's also perspective,
Yes.
that our consciousness can oftentimes be shaped by our perspective.
Yes.
So where we are in time and space,
Yes.
and how we view ourselves in relationship to other things,
Right.
we may feel, or we may believe or experience that those perspective experiences are concrete and set, but they're really just perspectives. Because as we sit on the earth,
Right.
and I'm just trying to summarize what you're saying, as we are on the earth is rotating on its axis. And when it rotates on its axis, it changes its perspective, and relationship to the sun that make it appear as if we have a night and day.
Yes.
And we're experiencing night and day, but if we was off the planet, we wouldn't experience night and day.
Precisely. That is what I was saying earlier when I mentioned the difference between reality and actuality. See, our reality on being on the planet, because we consider that the planet itself is not doing what it's actually doing, it's moving. But our reality is that it's not moving, but in actuality it is. So we may have a reality that in fact is not in actuality. So therefore, we have a perspective from where we sit, from the mindset that we have, from the education that we received, and in many instances, the education that we have not received. And as such, we have a viewpoint that in fact is not in actuality, but it is our reality.
So that's making me think about how human beings have created mythology and stories that sort of relate back to explaining this phenomenon of night and day, sunrise and sunset, winter and spring, winter and summer, summer and fall, you know, that we use different types of metaphors to describe these things. And we even attribute, you know, like this force or this power from which we come from. And we oftentimes put, human beings oftentimes put human qualities to those experiences and to what we perceive as being this universal mind, which is really beyond our capacity to really understand. So we sort of call it God.
Yes.
And we say that he's a he, number one, and then we say that he's angry.
It also creates the delusion in our own mind, because when we create a myth, is an effort to give us an explanation for something that we don't know. So we're operating in ignorance, but we provide an explanation because our mind says we need to know something that we don't know. So we create something to give us some stability about something that we don't know. So therefore we put something there that's not true.
So would you say, we're gonna wrap it up, but would you say that in some instances that the myth can be informative if it's formulated in a way that really reflects the reality or the actuality, or both, of what it's trying to describe, because it's really a way of describing metaphorically.
Well, one has to, and again, the word to use, metaphor, is very important, because there's a difference between connotation and denotation. So a metaphor is there to give you an explanation about something that you cannot explain, but to give you at least some way of explaining something that you know nothing of. So you're trying to explain something out of your own ignorance without admitting that you don't know. So you provide a story, a metaphor, but the metaphor is there to give you a contextual understanding that the something that you're talking about is true and not true at the same time. But you have to know the difference between a metaphor and a literality, okay? If you read the Bible as a literal statement, you get a whole different meaning than if you read it as a metaphorical understanding. It's very different.
Yes.
But it is our effort to explain something that we don't have knowledge of, but rather than admit that we don't know, we say, well, here's what we can utilize as something we don't know. So all myths in their own way has value, but one has to understand them metaphorically. If not, then one runs the risk of thinking something that's real, really real, but in fact is not actual. It just simply is a point of view.
Okay. Well, I think we've sort of created a groundwork upon which we can start further discussion.
Fine.
So we have set the stage, and we have established the epistemological foundation for our discussion. And I think that in terms of the audience that we're trying to address, that's what we want to do. We want to give them tools upon which they're able to start the process of critical thinking.
Okay.
You know, so the study of how to think, the study of how to create consciousness. You know, there's a process, and there are principles that we want to be able to get to. So I think this has established a great foundation, and I look forward to further conversations with you and learning from my architect teacher.
Well, thank you for getting me in trouble.
Yes, sir. Well, you know, we all in trouble, because every time we speak, we are pissing somebody off.
That's probably true.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, brother.